Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words, really, because you haven't heard from me yet, and I just wanted to say a little bit about my role and my observations, if you like, just before we watch the film, just to place that in context. And even though I'm the only prosecutor here, I believe, I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really glad that we're having this opportunity to come together to have this really honest and adult debate about how we tackle these issues. And actually, when we stop and analyze it, the reality is we have a lot more in common than we have apart. So it would be good to keep that in mind. I'm an independent prosecutor. I don't work for the Ministry of Justice in England and Wales, so as such, I'm here more to explain what the law is in England and Wales and not to provide perhaps the policy justification for it. Now, in England and Wales, we will prosecute for transmission, whether that is intentional or reckless, but we don't prosecute. There's no criminal offence of exposure, and there's no criminal offence of failing to disclose status. So I guess in the context of the discussion that we had this morning, it's that area around reckless prosecutions, which is perhaps where there's a difference of view between what England and Wales do and what those here representing the various agencies believe. But as I say, I'm here really to explain what we do rather than why England and Wales have reached this particular position. We're here to talk about the prosecutorial guidelines that we have in place in England and Wales, and the film that we'll watch shortly is going to explain how that came about, some of the obstacles that we faced along the way, but really the content and outcome of those guidelines will come through. But a further point I really wanted to make was that in terms of the success of these guidelines, the success of these guidelines will not necessarily be particularly visible because you won't get to hear about those cases. We saw on various people's slides this morning the lurid headlines that various sub-editors will put in their newspapers. And generally, it's when a person is convicted of a crime of this nature that it becomes part of the public consciousness. And there are, of course, in England and Wales, a small number of prosecutions that we do bring. Now, this is running around we brought about 20 cases since 2007. So we're talking about a small number of cases. Aside from those 20 or so cases, there are significantly more cases which have been brought to the CPS where we've applied the guidelines that you're going to hear about now, and we've decided that no action should be taken against the person. Now, we accept that more needs to be done in terms of how quickly that process works, and there may be some circumstances where the individual has been put through a very unpleasant ordeal simply from having had the police come in, arrest them, take away their property, etc. So there's more work that we need to do, and we're not claiming it's a perfect system. But what we would want you to just have in mind is that there will be a lot of cases which the police will investigate and the prosecution authority will decide this shouldn't be prosecuted, and that will be the end of the matter. Just wanted to just say a couple of things really in conclusion, and this was following on from the points this morning around preaching beyond the choir, going outside of this group of people who generally have a common aim and a common purpose. And as I say, I come as an independent prosecutor, not as a policy maker. So in a way, what I say now are really more my personal observations, having been involved in this work, rather than any official standpoint. But in terms of extending the reach of this work and really looking to persuade authorities and lawmakers to change their approach, I would just perhaps make two suggestions, really, or offer out two thoughts for you. Firstly, I would just remind everybody, as I said at the outset, that actually we have a lot more in common with each other than perhaps we have different to each other. And I think it would be really useful just to bear that in mind. And at the risk of sounding like somebody who doesn't have a sense of humor, I think some of the language and the terminology around, speaking with the devil, etc., probably isn't that helpful when you're looking to try and build adult relationships with another agency. So as I say, we're amongst friends here, and as I know that comments are being made in good humour, but actually just to dislodge from your minds the suggestion that those involved in making laws and applying laws are somehow, your pariahs, I think would probably help you get to the next stage. And in doing that, it would just be helpful, I think, to try and see things, and I offer these comments respectfully, and I hope nobody is insulted by what I say, but if you could just perhaps see things from the other perspective, I think that might help you in overcoming some of the obstacles that you face. So, for example, we have heard a lot this morning, the line has been said, there's no evidence to suggest that prosecutions for transmission of sexually transmitted infections has a deterrent effect on other people's behaviour. And the way that line, that mantra, if you like, is put out there, suggests a misunderstanding of the purpose of any criminal justice system. And those involved in the justice system, whether they be the lawmakers in the Ministry of Justice or prosecutors or judges, just need to have a much wider consideration. Deterrence is one aspect, public health is one aspect, but we also have a responsibility to use the justice system for other goals and other ends. And amongst the other goals will be, as well as deterrence, there'll be issues around rehabilitation, but there'll also be issues around delivering justice for victims and recognizing completely what's been said about the mutual responsibility. I think it's probably unhelpful to try and leave it at the point of saying that the victim or the complainant in these cases has no real right to a recourse and that there's no real right to honesty in the context of sexual relations. I mean, ultimately, we're dealing with scenarios, for example, of where individuals, complainants will responsibly ask their partners questions around whether they're infected or not, whether they've been tested, and where certain individuals will lie to that other person. And based on that lie, the complainant will be making an informed decision, or what they think is an informed decision. Of course, it won't be a genuinely informed decision because they will have been lied to. So for that person there who ultimately is infected and sees the justice system as bringing them some recourse, I think it may not be enough just to say, well, everybody's got the right to be dishonest in the field of human relations. You by all means say the criminal justice response is disproportionate, but I think if you're going to say that, you need to offer some kind of an alternative for those victims or complainants who are in this position where they are. And there's various pieces of work going on around restorative justice, which is an alternative approach to prosecution, which might possibly be something that could be explored. I'm not saying that's necessarily the solution, but I don't think it really helps just to end your argument at the point of there shouldn't be any criminal justice response, and that victim or complainant needs to be left where they are. And then the final point I would make would be just about getting the attention of the law and policy makers. And I think you just need to do what we've been doing today, and that's highlighting the much wider impact of this relatively small number of prosecutions. Now, justice systems, I speak of England and Wales, but I suspect that others around the world are in a similar position, are absolutely creaking under a vast array of competing priorities, and those other priorities will often have far more direct victims. So, for example, in England and Wales, those who are victims of rape and sexual offences are making up, thousands of members of the population are victims of those crimes. Likewise, hate crimes, vast numbers of people are victims of a hate crime. So for the law and policymakers, these are key priority areas. Now, if you want to really push STI transmission up the agenda, you need to do what Susan was saying this morning, which is look beyond this small number of cases that are actually prosecuted and look at this much wider ripple effect. Look at the rock that's thrown into the pool and the much wider impact it has on society. And I think by really getting those messages across, that would be the way to grab the attention of those who are responsible for law and policy. So those are just a few introductory words from me. We're going to watch the film now. It's about 30 minutes, so there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. And as I say, I'm genuinely pleased to be here, and I'm really genuinely interested to hear your questions and hear what your own experiences are. Okay, thank you.